Dr. Deborah Sword. For decades, I've been a conflict specialist, and I want to share with you my research and experience in these short podcasts based on my book, Conflict Owner's Manual. I'm here with my co-host and friend, Tyson Bankert.
Hi everyone, my name is Tyson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an artist and community facilitator.
So last week we talked about how to change other people's behavior, which you can't do. And that got me thinking. In the
Mm,
many years I've been a conflict manager, the solution that most parties prefer is for the other people or person to change. So I wasn't surprised to get a little bit of pushback with people saying, how do I change the other person's behavior? Because that's what's creating the conflict. And
right.
that brings up the common three-step dance pattern that describes a lot of conflict. So step one, the first person, that's them. They act or speak. The second person, that's you,
Mm,
interprets those actions or words. And step three, the second person, still you, reacts based on the interpretation that you made in step two. So they speak or act, you interpret, and you react based on that interpretation. So the question is about step one, changing them. And most answers to this question will advise you on steps two or three, because that's where you have real control.
mm,
But my answer is a little different.
okay.
There's a preliminary step, a step zero, that's the foundation of changing the conflict dance. And I want to talk about step zero.
Okay. Step zero. Yeah, that I'm okay. I'm really curious to know a little bit more about what that will sound like because I think many of us respond differently at step two, right? Depending on that relationship, depending on how we're feeling, the conditions that are in place, and thinking about how we need to manage our reactions. That person coughs, and sometimes you can react differently, right?
Yeah.
And it's where we think we have control, which is true based on what we've talked about today or the last few weeks, right? But I know of times where once I learn or understand about how the other person is showing up in step one, right? Then I can then change how I respond in step two, for example. But starting at step two does build your skills for managing your reactions, and I support that. I think it's a really great beginning. You may have experienced a situation or interpreting someone as being in a very bad mood, only to learn that the other person has suffered a recent loss, for example. You changed your opinion, and that person's bad mood isn't really a bad mood anymore. It's just grief. And this is really using a skill called perspective taking. And I need to appropriately respond in step two. That's beginning to managing your reaction at stage two. But I'm really curious, Deborah, what is that step zero? What's that preliminary step that we can actually be taking before we even think about how we need to respond in step two to someone's version of themselves in step one?
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned thinking about it, because that is step zero.
Mm,
So the skills deeper than managing your reaction involve thinking about how you think,
mm,
double loop thinking. While you're thinking about how you think. And you can do that both when you're in conflict and when you're calm. What's going on in your life and your environment that impacts how generous or stingy you're able to be in your perspective taking, as you mentioned? So, I'm proposing this preliminary step zero is based on research that expands your abilities, such as how you normalize what you experience, how resilient are you at coping with setbacks, what's
mm,
your mindset, to recognize your surroundings that clutter up what negatively affects you, your trigger points, and whether you actually believe you can multitask, which isn't really very effective, since
mhm,
it just increases stress and decreases your clear thinking. So, as you're thinking about how you're going to interpret, think about how you're thinking about it. Am I thinking I'm going to interpret this a particular way because of where I'm at, what grief I've experienced, my bad mood? So, you're doing this meta thinking. And if you can do that, then your reactions are you're better able to choose how you want to react and how you want to be in the world, how you want to be with that person.
Mm. So what I hear you say is that's really conflict prevention, right? It's thinking about those conditions beforehand that might cause some of of those conflicts, or to emerge in different ways. It's a great idea to not even let the conflict start. I mean, if that's where the pattern that you end up sort of often seeing, because you see the other person's perspective, or once you can see the other person's perspective, and don't get to step one, the other person's behavior, which once you would have maybe set you off, is now something you can deal with using those advanced skills that you are mentioning, Deborah. You've gone deeper than perspective taking because knowing your thinking helps you understand others. That's giving thinking about thinking the attention it deserves. And it's really about kind of how to host others in that space, I think about.
Exactly. And we were discussing it a little bit last week when
Mm,
we talked about conflict patterns. You remember we talked that human brains work in patterns
right.
and they
It's like,
cycle.
oh, yeah.
You have the triggering event, the stress, the fear of failure.
Mm,
You engage the reflexes, shut down the higher level thinking. When you can't think clearly, you get anxiety, stress, fear of failure, and you're back on the cycle. So if you're thinking about how you're thinking, then you're triggered. You interpret it, the trigger, you want to react, but you're thinking about it. You're thinking, wait, I just got triggered. I'm now going to look at the triggering event and how it's affecting my thinking. So you're taking conflict that thrives on the reactive pattern, and you're thinking about your thinking before the triggering event can shift you into that pattern that
mm,
shuts down your higher brain level. And so you function better. You're happier with yourself because you can think your way through the
mm,
conflict.
mm. Oh, it's so great. Well, we'll be back every week. So please join us again and tell your friends that we're discussing how to do conflict better, because you never know when you might be called upon to be conflict competent.
Exactly. And we all need to own our conflicts, which is what the
Mm.
conflict owner's manual will show you. So thanks for listening, and we hope you'll subscribe to our podcast.